Welcome to the Plagues Project.
10 plagues, many angles.
Now more than ever.
Come learn with us.
For me, the Bible is not only a text that I teach, but what I call a central orienting text, which plays a central role alongside other works as I try to figure out what the world is really like. Thus, it is no surprise that I've taught about the Bible in relation to the current pandemic or magefa. As a critical biblical scholar, I don't expect the Bible to give me an answer to what's going on, but instead expect it to show me a range of possible answers. To my mind, the strength of critical biblical scholarship is that it opens up the Bible as a polyvalent, multivocal work, offering different answers for different times in a person's life and different perspectives that suit different people. So returning to the main topic, how involved is the biblical God in plagues? I would like to explore several different answers that the Bible offers to this question. The first answer is certainly the best known, but I would really like to emphasize that it is not the only answer that is given in the Bible, namely that God is directly responsible for everything good and bad that happens in this world. This is especially obvious in the narratives in Sefer Shmot, in the book of Exodus concerning the plagues, and is found, for example, in this, what I'd call a quasi-summary, in Exodus 9:13, immediately before the hail plague. Ki bapam hazot, ani sholeach et kol magefotai el libcha, uva'avadecha uva'amecha. I'll just stick to the first half of the verse. For this time, I, God, will send all of my plagues against your person and your courtiers. This is God acting directly. He is the subject of the verb sholeach, to send, and he is totally in control here, as he is in most of the plague narratives. But that is not the only perspective that we see within the Tanakh, within the Hebrew Bible. The book of Samuel has a very complex history of composition. And the last 4 chapters or so of Samuel do not really fit in compositionally to the rest of the book or chronologically to the rest of the book, and are seen by most scholars as an appendix of additional material which an editor found at some point and found it easiest to stick at the end of the book. The very last chapter deals with a census that King David takes of the people. And because the census results in a terrible plague against Israel, and if you want to see more about censuses and plagues, please take a look at this particular posting on thetorah.com. But in any case, the author clearly wanted to explain why such a thing would happen, and his explanation is really quite remarkable. Vayosef af Adonai lacharot b'Yisrael, vayaset et David bahem lemor, lech minei et Yisrael be'et Yehuda. The anger of the Lord again flared up against Israel, and it incited, the subject here is really the anger of God, not God, incited David against them, saying, go number Israel and Judah, and since David and his people are going to be punished for the plague, in this case, it is the anger of God, Av Adonai, which here is really represented somehow as separate from God, that is responsible for this terrible plague that is going to inflict all of Israel. In other cases, here this is my position number 3, it is not God who is responsible for a plague or for punishing an individual or a group, but a figure, perhaps a divine figure under God's control, who is responsible. Again, if I had more time, I would explain why I have divine there with a question mark, explaining what divine means, explaining the extent to which the Bible is actually a monotheistic book, is well beyond the time limit. that I have. This is from the second set of episodes in the book of Job. In the first set, everything around Job is punished. He loses his house, he loses his children, he loses his personal property, and still he is steadfast and refuses to curse God. In the second set of episodes, this person, or this individual, this being, called in Hebrew Hasatan, here properly translated as the adversary, is again speaking to God and asks God if he, the adversary, is able to punish Job. Please note, the adversary is not allowed to go out independently and to punish Job or any other individual, but needs permission from God. I'll read in the Hebrew. I'll gloss a little in the English. Please feel free to follow in the English. Verse 4. Vayan Satan et Adonai vayomar, or ba'ad or, v'chol asher la'ish yitain ba'ad nafsho. This skin for skin is clearly some sort of ancient proverb that we do not fully understand. It's not crucial for understanding the broader context. Verse 5 is crucial. Ulam shlach na yadecha b'ga el atzmo ve'el besaro, im lo el panecha yivarechecha. And so lay a hand on his bones and his flesh. He will surely blaspheme you to your face. So God gives him permission. Verse 6, Vayomer Adonai el Hasatan, hino v'yadecha, ach et nafsho shemor. So here, Hasatan, the adversary, has permission to inflict a personal plague on Job, as long as that plague is not fatal. And Hasatan, who is in the divine council, then leaves the divine council in verse 7, Vayitze Hasatan me'et pnei Adonai, and moving from heaven to earth, Vayach et Yov bishchin ra, mikaf raglo va'ad kodkodo, inflicts Job with a severe inflammation. So here my main point is that God does not inflict Job directly, but rather someone under God's control, one of these divine figures, inflicts an individual. And if you want to see this in a broader context of a plague brought against a wide number of people, the story in 2 Kings chapters 18 through 19 or 20 deals with the events of 701 BCE, where the Assyrian king Sennacherib besieged Jerusalem and ultimately left. And one of the reasons given in this particular set of texts for why the Assyrian army left before conquering Jerusalem is found in 2 Kings 19:35. Vayihi balayla hahu, vayetze malach Adonai, Vayach b'machane Ashur me'ah shmonim v'chamisha aleph. Vayashkimu v'boker v'hine chulam pigarim meitim. That night an angel of the Lord, Malach Adonai, went out and struck down 185,000 in the Assyrian camp. And the following morning, they were all dead corpses. In other words, it is not God who does this, but God delegates in all sorts of ways. And here it is Malach Adonai, the divine angel, better the divine messenger, somebody who would later in Jewish texts would be called Malach Hamavet, the angel of death, who does God's particular bidding. A slightly different version of this idea is found in the fourth text. And here I'm going to concentrate only on the second part of Exodus chapter 12, verse 23. This is in the context of the death of the firstborn, and there describing why the Israelites are going to be spared of this death. The text says, I pick up here right after the parentheses. Ufasach Adonai al hapetach, v'lo yitain hamashchit lavo el batechem lingo. Here, picking up here, and the Lord will, I would translate this as protect the door and not let the destroyer, hamashchit, enter and smite your home. Some of you might be very surprised by my translation here. I am rendering the Hebrew word ufasach as to protect, a meaning that is very well attested in elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible, for example, in Isaiah chapter 31:5, where it is parallel and in the context of other words for protection that makes a lot more sense than the usual translation of skipping for this particular verse. And what this verse suggests, which is slightly different than the third perspective, is that sometimes God releases these malevolent figures in the world. In this case, Hamashchit, the destroyer, but God plays a role in protecting those who deserve to be protected. In this case, by standing in front of the doors of the Israelites. I'm almost imagining God as a do not enter sign or a crime scene from police, do not enter, thereby protecting the Israelites. And you have a similar notion of figures who are let loose to wreak havoc in the well-known Psalm 91, which is part of the early morning prayers in Judaism and is also part of the funeral ceremony in Judaism, where God, if you take a look at verse 3, God is going to save the individual, mi dever havot, from the destructive plague. And here I actually need to correct myself a little bit. It is not only that God is not directly involved, excuse the double negative, in destroying people, but God is not also directly involved in saving those who are not going to be destroyed. Ki malachav yitzavelach lishmorcha bechol drachecha. For he, God, will order his malachim, his angels or messengers, to guard you wherever you go. Now, sometimes you have a combination of these various ideas in biblical texts. So the fourth notion is that sometimes angels will be released to wreak havoc on the world that we know. And the second notion, which we saw earlier, is that God's anger is responsible. In a text which is well known from the Passover Haggadah, concerning the number of plagues that befell the Egyptians, taken from Psalm 78, which includes within it a narrative of retelling the plague episode. There you have Yishalach bam charon apo evra v'za'am v'tzara mishlachat malachei ra'im. He let loose his burning anger upon them. The object are the Egyptians, wrath, indignation, a band of deadly messengers. Now, I don't want to get into the finer points of biblical grammar, but here it is important to note a difference in grammatical forms between the first position and what we see here. In the first position, or the first perspective, God sholeachs in the kal his plagues against the Egyptians. That is different from what we have in this text in Psalm 78, where the form is yishalach in the PL, to let loose. And thus, God is not directly responsible, but both God's anger, perspective number 2, charon apo, and the malachim ra'im, or the mishlachat malachim ra'im, the band of deadly messengers, which are let loose, these are responsible. And I'd like to conclude with a fifth perspective. The book of Chronicles, in Hebrew, Divrei Hayamim, is a retelling of much of Samuel and Kings and some other literature, or other biblical literature as well. So here I need to remind you of the opening of 2 Samuel chapter 24 from that appendix at the end of Samuel, where it is Af Adonai, the anger of the Lord, which flares up against Israel and is responsible for the plague. Chronicles, following its ideology, Chronicles is probably from the 4th pre-Christian century, quite a few centuries later than the book of Samuel or Kings. And it often rewrites its earlier sources in light of its ideology. And you can see that the second half of this verse is almost identical to what you have in the book of 2 Samuel, but the first half is really quite different. Vaya'amod Satan al Yisrael. Satan arose against Israel, and it is Satan who is responsible for inciting David to count Israel, to initiate a census. This is the only place in the Bible where you have Satan with a capital S. Again, not to go into the finer points of biblical grammar, but when you supposedly have Satan in the book of Job, he is really not present at all, because there, as you can see, he is always called Hasatan with the definite article the, and Hebrew personal names can never have the definite article in front of them. Thus, the correct translation here, the adversary, though I'm not quite sure why the A of adversary should be capitalized. But nevertheless, here you have something quite remarkable. Satan, capital S, Satan, an independent divine or quasi-divine being who arose against Israel. And please note, unlike the book of Job, this Satan is not appointed by God, but seems to be acting independently in creating all the problems that are going to befall Israel. So let's return to the main question. How involved is God in plagues according to the Hebrew Bible? My answer in this case, this is the same as my answer to most questions on the Bible. It depends on which text you like the most and which text you prove to privilege. But I do hope that you find one of these texts and perspectives helpful in this very difficult time.